There is a hidden history behind every bite we eat today. That history is stitched together by soil, seed, sweat, and systems of power that most of us never consider while cooking or eating. In the first few minutes of this episode, we will travel from muddy riverbanks to neon-lit warehouses and show how human choices about farming changed human destiny. This story begins with a simple, uncomfortable truth about human survival and abundance. Food is never only nutrition, and agriculture has always been political, aesthetic, and technological at the same time. The first great pivot in our relationship to food was not a single moment, but a long transformation. Early humans shifted from chasing wild animals and gathering seasonal fruits to tending stands of wild grasses and encouraging certain plants to grow nearer camps. That slow, selective process of domestication changed not only what people ate, but how they lived, worked, and imagined the future. When humans began to control plants and animals, the rhythms of life fundamentally changed. Settlements became permanent, population densities climbed, and whole social systems reorganized around predictable harvests. Domestication was both biological experiment and cultural choice, and it left fingerprints on our plates for millennia. Wheat, barley, rice, and maize each traveled different routes from wild grasses to staple crops through human selection and ecological luck. Those early choices locked communities into dependencies on particular crops that would later define cuisines, social hierarchies, and even religious rituals. Different seeds meant different cooking techniques and different foods to preserve through winter or trade. Once humans learned to store surplus grains, they could take risks, build cities, and invest in crafts other than food production. Irrigation and the first engineered fields elevated agriculture from opportunism to engineering. People in river valleys dug channels, built simple dams, and managed water to coax higher yields from arid ground. Those hydraulic systems created surpluses that supported bureaucracies, armies, and monumental architecture that would have been impossible for hunter-gatherer groups to build. Where water planners ruled, states followed, and crops became strategic resources rather than simple food. The control of irrigation was often the control of people, power, and the narratives of civilization itself. The plow was a disruptive device that rewrote agricultural possibilities and social relations. Turning the soil allowed deeper rooting crops and new rotations that increased fertility and yields across seasons. Along with animal traction, the plow made larger fields manageable by fewer people while creating demand for metallurgy, transport, and storage infrastructure. Technologies like the plow made scale possible, but scale demanded organization and often coercion. Larger fields meant more grain to tax, and taxes meant complex institutions that could fund armies, roads, and elites. Surplus grain had a physical consequence that changed daily meals and ceremonial tables alike. Once societies could reliably store food through seasons, new foods and culinary traditions emerged around bread, porridge, and fermented staples. Bread in many societies became a symbol of life, and grain storage facilities became strategic assets worth defending or raiding. Storage technologies also shaped markets and food security by creating buffers against famine. Grain silos, communal granaries, and royal storehouses allowed redistributions and censuses that made rulers into gatekeepers of abundance. Animal domestication introduced dairy, meat, hides, and labor to agricultural economies in unprecedented ways. Cows, goats, and sheep became milk and protein sources, but also cultural markers of wealth and ritual importance. Herding required mobility, grazing land, and social rules about ownership that complicated relationships between pastoralists and settled farmers. Pastoral and agricultural ways of life often complemented each other economically while clashing territorially. The mixing of these lifestyles produced hybrid cuisines like yogurt and cheese that combined preservation techniques with new flavors. Fermentation and preservation were early culinary responses to agricultural abundance and scarcity alike. Salt curing, smoking, pickling, and fermenting turned perishable harvests into reliable provisions for lean months and long journeys. These techniques were not just practical solutions, but the origins of profound flavors that became central to regional cuisines across continents. Preservation practices allowed food to travel further and at larger scales, influencing trade and culinary exchange. The taste born of necessity often became identity markers and prized commodities across markets. Climate and soil shaped which foods became staples in different regions long before cultural preference took hold. Rice dominated wet tropical lowlands, while wheat thrived in temperate plains and maize became king in the Americas. Those ecological constraints produced distinct cooking methods. utensils, and social rhythms around planting and harvest seasons. Cuisines were ecological responses that later accumulated layers of meaning through ritual, festivals, and identity. Geography was the starting point for taste, and human culture amplified those early ecological choices into culinary tradition. Spices, oils, and flavoring agents moved beyond local fields through trade routes that rewired cuisines and economies. Spices were catalysts of global commerce and sometimes worth more than gold by weight, prompting voyages, empires, and violent encounters. The demand for exotic flavors drove botanical exchanges that reshaped what people could cook and how they cooked. The movement of taste altered agricultural priorities by creating new markets for lucrative crops. Entire regions specialized in single export commodities, which could transform landscapes and social orders in a single generation. The Columbian Exchange was one of the most consequential culinary transformations in human history. Crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes traveled across oceans and contradicted prior assumptions about suitability and taste. Those new crops sometimes supported huge population booms in Europe and Asia while simultaneously devastating indigenous ecologies and food systems in colonized regions. Beyond food, the exchange carried pathogens, animals, and agricultural techniques that rewired societies. The consequences of that global swap still echo in modern diets and economic dependencies around former colonies. Religion and taboo also steered agricultural choices and culinary practices across generations. Sacred crops, fasting rules, and food prohibitions influenced planting cycles and market patterns in subtle but persistent ways. Rituals connected harvest to cosmologies, and those connections made certain foods into communal symbols beyond mere nutrition. Food laws could preserve biodiversity in some cases and restrict it in others depending on context. The cultural weight of food often shaped political alliances and economic decisions as much as weather and soil quality did. Plantation agriculture and colonial extraction remade landscapes and cuisines through monoculture and enforced labor. Sugar, tobacco, rubber, and cotton required massive tracts of land and labor that were often supplied through coercion and slavery. Those plantation systems concentrated wealth and determined global trade patterns that favored industrializing powers while undermining local food autonomy. Monoculture intensified production but reduced ecological resilience and food diversity in colonized regions. The long-term impacts included soil depletion, social displacement, and culinary homogenization, as cash crops replaced diverse systems. The Industrial Revolution accelerated agricultural transformation through mechanization, chemistry, and steam power. Tractors, threshers, and mills turned farming into an industry with scale, speed, and capital intensity. Mechanization removed many agrarian jobs while producing unprecedented surpluses that fed urban populations and fueled industrial labor markets. Industry also introduced new dependencies on fossil fuels and manufactured inputs for farming. The increasing distance between field and table altered tastes, timetables, and the very meaning of seasonal eating for city dwellers. Synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides rewrote yields and ecological equations in the 20th century. Nitrogen fertilizers massively increased productivity, but also introduced consequences like runoff dead zones and long-term soil degradation. Chemical control of pests boosted short-term harvests while encouraging resistance and monocultural vulnerabilities across landscapes. Those technological gains became politically entangled with corporate power and market consolidation. The agricultural inputs that raised yields also centralized decision-making in ways that reduced farmer autonomy and increased systemic risk. The Green Revolution promised rescue from hunger through high-yield varieties and intensive inputs. In many regions, these techniques did increase food production dramatically and saved countless lives from starvation. However, the Green Revolution also favored certain crops, required irrigation and inputs, and sometimes marginalized smallholder varieties and local knowledge. The net effect was complex and context-dependent, producing both improved food security and new vulnerabilities. As yields rose, so did debates about equity, sustainability, and who benefited from technological change. Industrial meat production changed protein consumption patterns and environmental footprints dramatically. Concentrated animal feeding operations increased meat availability and lowered prices by intensifying feed inputs and waste concentrations. Those systems produced culinary abundance but also created public health risks. Ethical debates and massive greenhouse gas emissions tied to global diets. Meat industrialization altered cooking practices as well, encouraging processed and convenience foods over whole animal preparations. The cultural shift from nose-to-tail cooking toward packaged cuts reflects industrial incentives more than culinary necessity. The rise of processed food industries reframed what kitchens meant and how people ate. Milling, canning, and later refrigeration standardized ingredients and extended shelf life in ways that disconnected consumers from seasonal cycles. Processed foods offered convenience and safety for growing cities, but also introduced sugar, salt, and fat profiles that reshaped health outcomes worldwide. As processing scaled, culinary skill sets shifted from preservation techniques to purchasing and reheating. The modern supermarket became a culinary middleman that influenced taste through branding and supply chain control. Globalization compressed culinary worlds into surprising hybrids and tensions that continue to evolve. International trade and migration spread ingredients and methods across borders, producing cuisines that were once impossible in any single place. At the same time, global supply chains concentrated control of seed, inputs, and processing in the hands of a few multinational firms. This concentration created both culinary cross-fertilization and fragility in food systems. A disruption in one part of the world could ripple to plates everywhere, revealing how interconnected supply networks really are. Modern agriculture now sits at an ethical and existential crossroads that affects every human being. We must ask whether abundance under current systems is sustainable, equitable, or desirable in the long term. Questions about biodiversity, soil health, labor rights, and climate commit us to choices that will echo across generations. These choices are no longer purely technical because they embody values about what food should be and who should control it. The politics of farming determine more than calories, they shape dignity, health, and cultural memory. Alternative agricultural movements emerged as a reaction to industrial models and their failures. Organic farming, regenerative agriculture, and permaculture emphasize soil health, biodiversity, and ecosystem services, rather than mere yield maximization. These approaches often restore culinary diversity by valuing heirloom varieties and traditional techniques that industrial systems displaced, while promising alternative systems grapple with scale, affordability, and policy support in ways that industrial models did not. The question remains whether they can feed billions while preserving the biosphere and ensuring livelihoods for farming communities. Urban farming and community gardens reconnect people with the origins of their food in dense cities. Rooftops, vacant lots, and vertical farms bring production into consumer spaces and shorten supply chains dramatically. These urban experiments create social value through education, food access, and localized resilience against supply shocks. However, urban agriculture cannot replace rural production entirely, and often depends on complementary rural systems for staple crops. The future likely involves hybrid networks that combine city-level initiatives with regional agricultural diversity. Biotechnology and gene editing present both promise and peril for future crops and culinary forms. Techniques like CRISPR enable precise changes in plant traits for drought resistance and nutritional enhancement in ways past breeding could not match. These innovations could increase resilience and target nutritional deficiencies in vulnerable regions if deployed responsibly and equitably. Conversely, the governance of biotech is contested, and the concentration of intellectual property rights raises questions about who benefits. The ethics of editing the genetic basis of our food demand more than laboratory arguments. They require democratic deliberation about futures we want. Climate change is altering agricultural possibility maps faster than policy can respond in many places. Shifts in rainfall, temperature, and pest ranges are changing where certain crops can thrive and how kitchens must adapt. Some regions will gain new options, while others lose millennia of agricultural wisdom tied to particular microclimates. Adapting agriculture will demand both technological innovation and respect for local knowledge and social structures. Food security in a warming world will hinge on flexible systems that value diversity over singular productivity metrics. Food security is not only about production but about distribution, access, and cultural acceptability. The world produces enough calories to feed its population, yet hunger persists because of inequality, war, and broken supply chains. Food deserts and inaccessible markets show that the problem is often institutional rather than strictly agronomic. Policies around land rights, market access, and social safety nets determine whether production translates into nourishment. Successful food systems policies must reconcile efficiency with justice and local culinary needs. Smallholder farmers remain the backbone of food cultures and agricultural biodiversity globally. Their practices often maintain crop varieties and techniques that industrial systems marginalize, but that are vital for resilience. Supporting smallholders can protect cultural cuisines while promoting sustainable land stewardship and local economies. Yet smallholders face pressures from land grabbing, market volatility, and climate impacts that threaten generational knowledge transfer. Empowering these farmers requires policy, finance, and respect for knowledge systems that Western modernization narratives often dismiss. Consumer choices and culinary creativity can act as levers that reshape farming incentives at scale. When diners demand seasonal, local, and diverse foods, markets respond by supporting farmers who protect biodiversity and soil health. Chefs and food movements have long demonstrated the power of taste to preserve rare varieties and cooking techniques. However, taste is influenced by marketing, price, and convenience. So change often requires shifts in policy and culture simultaneously. Collective culinary taste can be a powerful political force when aligned with sustainability goals. Technology will continue to compress the distance between growth and plate in unexpected ways. Vertical farms, controlled environment agriculture, and AI-driven supply chains promise precise nutrient profiles and reduced transport emissions for some crops. These techniques could relieve pressure on fragile ecosystems while enabling fresh produce access in dense urban centers far from traditional farmland. But technological solutions can entrench inequities if ownership and knowledge remain concentrated among affluent actors. The promise of technology will matter little unless it is paired with equitable access and sustainable governance frameworks. Thinking about the future of food forces us to confront questions of power, taste, and memory. Will we choose agricultural systems that prioritize ecological balance and community resilience, or will we continue to favor cheap calories and concentrated corporate control? The choices embedded in how we grow food are also moral choices about the kind of societies we want to inhabit. This is not a story only about technology or yield, it is about the human values that steer those technical options. Our kitchens carry the legacy of those choices, and our meals will carry their consequences forward. The forbidden kitchen is not literally locked, it is hidden behind norms, markets, and habits that we rarely question. By tracing agriculture from ancient fields to modern supply chains, we find that food is a ledger of history, power, and resilience. Every recipe and culinary preference contains echoes of conquest, survival strategies, and ecological choices that span continents and centuries. If you cook or if you eat, you participate in an agricultural story that is still unfolding. Understanding that story gives us the leverage to demand better farms, fairer markets, and tastier futures for everyone. Practical steps forward begin with curiosity and civic engagement about what lands on your plate. Support for fair food policies, smallholder rights, and agroecological research can shift incentives in meaningful ways. Consumer choices paired with collective action can nudge markets toward biodiversity, healthier soils, and better working conditions for agricultural laborers. Change will require both systemic reforms and everyday practices that demand transparency all along the supply chain. The power of food movements has surprised many before, and it can surprise us again if we act intentionally. We should also remember that resilience is as much cultural as it is biological or technological. Maintaining food knowledge, seasonal recipes, and seed-saving practices preserves culinary diversity that industrial systems often erode. Those cultural practices are the human archives that can help communities adapt when supply chains strain under environmental or political stress. Protecting culinary heritage therefore becomes part of conservation and food security strategies. Cultural resilience anchors agricultural resilience in ways that laboratories and markets alone cannot replicate. As we imagine future kitchens, we must weigh convenience against ecological and social costs in honest terms. New technologies promise many benefits, but also risk amplifying existing inequities without careful governance. The moral imagination that guides our choices about agriculture will determine whether the future of food is restorative or extractive. This is a conversation about values disguised as a conversation about yield, price, and taste. Choosing a better food future means choosing different priorities at every scale from farm to policy to plate. The last ingredient in this story is humility about complexity and contingency. There are no simple utopias where one method solves every problem for every culture and climate. The future will require plural solutions, localized experimentation, global cooperation, and the humility to revise policies as we learn more about unintended consequences. Agriculture is simultaneously ancient and experimental, anchored by tradition and open to invention. That duality makes the narrative of food both maddeningly complex and profoundly hopeful. So the Forbidden Kitchen is forbidden because it hides hard truths about power, scarcity, and appetite. It is a place where choices about seed patents, dietary trends, and urban zoning converge into daily habits and political outcomes. Revealing those dynamics is not meant to shame, but to inform and empower people to demand better food futures. If we want kitchens that reflect ethics as well as taste, we must engage with agriculture at the policy level and at the dinner table. Practical engagement can transform hidden systems into democratic ones that serve broader public interests. There is no single villain in this story, only systems shaped by choices and incentives across centuries. Corporations, states, technologies, and communities each played roles that sometimes conflict and sometimes reinforce one another. Understanding those roles helps untangle where interventions might promote resilience, justice, and deliciousness for future generations. Food is therefore a moral and political medium where the future gets decided one meal at a time. The best policies and habits will be the ones that remember that complexity while acting with courage and care. Finally, remember that history is not destiny and taste is not fate. Both can be steered. The recipes we cherish can be adapted to new climates and new soils. If we preserve seeds, share knowledge, and support equitable innovation, our plates can become sites of regeneration rather than extraction if we align agricultural incentives with ecological limits and human dignity. If this episode has shifted how you see the ingredients on your table, then the Forbidden Kitchen has done its work. Change will start there and radiate outward into farms, markets, and policies around the world. If this gave you a new perspective on food and farming, please subscribe and stay curious with us. The story of agriculture is ongoing, and your choices matter in ways larger than you might think. Join the conversation by sharing this video, supporting local agriculture, and asking questions about where your food comes from.